The next part here, we're looking at the politics of the 1920s for this video segment. So throughout the 1920s, every president that we have is a Republican. As we know, when we discussed the 1920 election, we know that Warren Harding campaigned on the promise of a return to modernity, or I mean normalcy rather. And so what we see is that a lot of the presidents in the 1920s, as well as politicians in general, are sort of pushing to go away from a lot of the progressive reforms of the 19 teens. Warren Harding in particular was really much more of a figurehead than an actual political leader. He was not very, and his personal life was also marked with sort of some less than I don't know, less than ideal morals, right? Warren Harding actually was quite unfaithful to his wife. He had a child out of wedlock actually when he was campaigning. So like in terms of his moral credibility, it was not so great. And so actually a lot of his advisors actually purposely kept him out of the spotlight so that they didn't, very clearly reveal his inferiority. And so Harding's entire administration from 1921 to 1923, he dies in 1923 and is replaced by his vice president, Coolidge. Is really riddled with scandal. He surrounded himself by his cronies. They were called the Ohio Gang. We see them down here. So basically, the Ohio Gang was a group of politicians who associated with Harding, and a lot of them were involved directly in some of the political scandals that took place during the 1920s. One of the best examples of these scandals of the 1920s was the Teapot Dome scandal. And that was where a series of politicians, some of whom were in the Ohio Gang, were caught for accepting bribes from oil companies. So basically you see that there's this clear relationship, seems like it's going right back to the Gilded Age, right, where politicians are getting involved directly with private businesses for their own individual benefit. And so what's interesting about the Teapot Dome scandal is that this actually leads to an arrest of one of Harding's cabinet members. His interior secretary, Albert Fall, is actually arrested and then imprisoned for his involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal. And this is historical because this is the first time in history where we actually had a cabinet member go to jail for political scandals. So this isn't uncommon to us. We know we had scandals during Grant's administration, so it dates way back. But this is the first time that actually people are getting caught and held accountable for these crimes. And then another example of some scandal is that it's the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, is really aggressively working to trim the budget, and also he is bent on reducing the taxes that the wealthy pay. And this is a clear undoing of progressive policies where you saw the introduction of an income tax. So again, you see this sort of rolling away of progressive policies and policies now that are favoring the wealthy and favoring big businesses yet again. So it seems like, after some of the politics and economic policies in the 1920s, we were all but going back to the way it was before the progressive era. As I said earlier, Harding dies in 1923. And Calvin Coolidge becomes president. And Coolidge actually, again, really epitomized sort of the lack of presence of the 1920s presidents. Coolidge was known to only work about 4 hours each day, so he was very minimalistic in how he fulfilled his job in the White House. He continued that sort of business government partnership that characterized Harding's presidential term. So you still see that the government is very much like trying to work personally with private enterprises for their own benefit. So obviously this is not benefiting the working class, this is not benefiting labor unions. You get the idea. Again, it's going away from the progressive era. He also reduces federal spending, he cuts taxes, and he tries to block congressional initiatives that are going to benefit anyone but the wealthy or anyone but businesses. So we get a sense that Coolidge is very much also using economic policy to sort of clear a path for the free market and to benefit strong, large private businesses in particular. Another good example of how he was pro-business was that during the 1920s, I discussed this in the first video, but again, as the farmers start to struggle very clearly already in the 1920s, Congress actually wants to respond to their problems. And so Congress passes a bill called the McNary-Hougen Bill in the 1920s, and that would have provided significant aid to struggling farmers. But Coolidge vetoes it. He actually vetoes it twice. And so we see that there is very little push from the president to actually help out the struggling classes. And again, we see that this is really deviating away from progressivism. And arguably the fact that Coolidge vetoed this bill is going to exacerbate the problems that farmers are going to face once we reach the Great Depression. The next president we have in the 1920s was Herbert Hoover. He did have a role in the federal government throughout the 1920s, so before he actually becomes president. He acted as the Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge's administrations. And again, it's sort of business as usual. So his economic policy is very similar to Harding's and Coolidge. Okay, so one of the things that he does is he's very much, again, promoting the cooperation of the federal government with large businesses, right? So he oftentimes holds conferences and meetings to promote business efficiency. He does attempt to reduce competition between businesses by promoting the regulation and publishing of prices. So you do see that to a certain extent he is trying. I guess on the one hand it may seem bad because ultimately by reducing competition we may see that some oligopolies might emerge from this situation. But at the same time, he does seem to want to try to make the economy actually run efficiently. Also, he is very much behind the Bureau of Standards, which was an organization that set commercial standards for materials and products. So, for example, automobiles. So what he was doing with the Bureau of Standards with the automobile industry was trying to maximize production by making sure that the materials and products available were up to standard. And also the Bureau of Standards was meant to try to maximize worker, managerial, and industrial productivity. So ultimately the Bureau of Standards is again a way that we see his strong commercial background. We do see that he is, again, working to take away some progressive policies that were developed in the previous decade. One of the things that he does not stress, the way that someone like Roosevelt or Wilson did, was fighting against trusts. So again, we're going to see that some large private businesses are going to emerge, and we're going to see the growing presence of oligopolies yet again. And so because of Hoover's economic policies, we're going to see that there's a growing concentration of corporate wealth towards the end of the 1920s. As far as the financial situation is concerned after the war, as we know, European countries struggle significantly financially after the war is over. They bore the brunt of the wartime expenses because the war was actually fought in Europe. So when the war is over, the U.S. really emerges as the strongest economic power. It has the least amount of debt. And it's also really emerging as a creditor in the sense that because its economy is so strong, other countries are turning to the U.S. to borrow money. So one of the most prominent examples of that is, as you know, the Treaty of Versailles placed very severe war reparations on Germany's economy. And so one of the problems with that was that because the U.S. lent a lot of money to the Allied nations in World War I, the U.S. also needed to get paid back, right? So countries like Britain and France owed the U.S. a lot of money from the war. But Britain and France could not pay back the United States because they were waiting to get the reparation money from Germany. And so what the economic plan that results to sort of start this repayment process and to get money back to the U.S. is a plan called the Dawes Plan. And it's sort of this strange circular plan that, on the outset seems to, if anything, just sort of shift money from one person's hands to the other. And so what we have here is that the U.S. Actually loans money to Germany under the Dawes Plan. And the reason why they do that is so that Germany is able to actually pay reparations back to the Allied countries. And it has France as a particular example here. Okay, once France gets the money from Germany, then France is able to pay back the United States. So in a way, it seems sort of like the strange circle in the sense that the U.S. isn't really necessarily profiting; it's just getting back the money from the allied countries that it borrowed from. But it would not have gotten back that money if it had not lent the money to Germany to pay the allies countries, right? But what this really shows, even if it seems like a strange circle, is that most of Western Europe is now inexplicably tied to the U.S. economy. They're dependent on them to borrow. So this is a really significant development, which marks how World War I sort of turns the U.S. into one of the strongest world powers. All right. Another thing that we know is that the U.S. did not join the League of Nations after World War I, so we have to think about the ways in which the U.S. is still invested in peacekeeping after the war is over. All right, so you do see in general that the U.S. is very much interested, even though it doesn't join the League of Nations, it's interested in, for example, participating in some conferences that would prevent further conflict. So one of the things that they do is they participate in several disarmament conferences that take place, again, to try to sort of reduce the military production that takes place in all the countries that were previously involved in World War I. The other thing that the U.S. does, and many countries actually sign this pact, they signed what's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, and this was a renunciation of war. So essentially what the Kellogg-Briand Pact did was it said that, none of these countries would use war to resolve problems with other countries. Now we know that this is kind of a ridiculous promise because only a decade after the Kellogg-Briand Pact is signed, we're on the brink of World War II. So it's sort of a meaningless promise, as we know, but it's important for us to know that the U.S. was one of the signers of this pact. But behind the scenes, the U.S. maybe is not as interested in peacekeeping, or at the very least in demilitarization, as it may seem. Because in the background, the U.S. still spent about $250 million on new battleships. So that's a significant investiture that gives you the sense that the U.S. is not entirely bent on disarming itself. Another thing that we see is that, these two cartoons here give us a representation of how involved the U.S. actually might be in the peacekeeping process. This cartoon is indicating the idea that the U.S. was the cornerstone that held the League of Nations together. So without the U.S.'s participation, the entire league would eventually collapse. And then this is showing us how the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it's represented as a birthday cake, is inevitably going to fail when the crises of, there's a number of years here that you see, so the 1935, 36, 37, 38, and then finally the final straw with 1939, which totally blows up the concept of peace that the Kellogg-Briand Pact was meant to protect. All right, in terms of commerce and foreign policy, the U.S. was still very much interested in expanding its influence abroad. So we're going to see that, in particular, the U.S. is investing more and more money in developing markets in Latin America. And these maps here give you a sense of the natural resources that the U.S. is very much desiring in Latin America. So I wanted to pay particular attention to Chile and Peru, which were large-scale copper producers, which was important for the automotive industry. And then also countries like Venezuela, which were large-scale oil producers. So as we know, since the U.S. is becoming such a prominent automotive manufacturer, they rely upon these countries in Latin America for the raw materials that they need to build their autos. What we see is that, again, foreign policy is going to sort of closely ally with private business investments in these foreign countries. So again, in order to promote the automotive industries and in order to ensure that there's an effective oil supply, the U.S. actually grants many policies that are favorable towards these private businesses. And so what we see happening in terms of the U.S. investment in Latin America is it's really difficult for Latin American countries to kind of grow and diversify their economies because the U.S. is perpetually involved in their economic development. There's so much demand on specific products. So, in other words, the U.S. is placing so much demand on a country like Venezuela to keep exporting oil that it's really difficult for Venezuela to produce a very diverse array of products. And this is sort of ironic because, as you know, when Wilson was articulating his 14 points after World War I, one of the ideas that he was emphasizing was this notion of self-determination. So in other words, he wanted every country in the world to be able essentially to effectively govern itself. But with the U.S.'s investment in these foreign economies, we see that it's really difficult for these countries actually to determine their own future because the U.S. is sort of driving their economy to favor them. Okay, we're going to do one more video looking at the people who are sort of left behind in the 1920s, so minorities, women, and immigrant groups. So stay tuned for that last video.